Happy 7th anniversary. I want a divorce, and please do not ruin the mood of this expensive dinner with your crying. My husband, Julian, slid a thick manila envelope across the candlelit table of the most exclusive restaurant in the city, smiling as if he had just presented me with a diamond necklace. I sat frozen, my fork suspended in midair, staring at the bold letters of the divorce petition peeking out from the unsealed flap. Before I could even process the words, the velvet curtains of our private dining booth parted, and my mother-in-law, Beatrice, walked in alongside Julian's younger sister, Qley. Beatrice immediately slid into the booth next to her son, patting his hand affectionately while giving me a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. She told me that it was finally time for me to pack my bags and let Julian live the life he truly deserved with someone of his own social standing. Qley smirked, pulling out her phone to take a photo of my shocked face, muttering that she could not wait to post about how the family was finally getting a massive upgrade. I looked at Julian, the man I had supported for 8 years. The man whose rent I paid when his tech startup was nothing but a pile of unpaid bills and a broken laptop. He did not look guilty, nor did he look sad. He simply looked annoyed that my eyes were welling up with tears, telling me that he had specifically asked me not to make a scene because the champagne cost $600 a bottle. He said that he had reached a level of success where my middle-class mindset was holding him back, and that his company's recent public offering meant he was moving in circles where I simply did not fit. I asked him how he could do this on our anniversary, at a dinner he had begged me to dress up for, and he laughed, saying it was the perfect date because it symbolized a clean break and a fresh fiscal year. He then told me that he had already arranged for a moving company to pack up my belongings from our penthouse, and that my access to our joint bank accounts had been deactivated 2 hours ago. Beatrice chimed in, saying that a prenuptial agreement was a beautiful thing, and that I should be grateful Julian was letting me keep the cheap sedan he had bought me 3 years ago. I did not say another word, nor did I shed a single tear in front of them, because a sudden, cold wave of clarity washed over my entire body. I quietly stood up, picked up my purse, took the divorce papers, and walked out of the restaurant, leaving the 3 of them to enjoy their expensive champagne and celebrate my supposed downfall. As I walked down the bustling city streets in the freezing autumn air, I realized that Julian had made the single biggest mistake of his life, because he had forgotten one crucial detail about how his company was built. I did not go to a hotel. Instead, I drove straight to the office of my mentor and former professor, Evelyn, who was now one of the most feared corporate and divorce attorneys in the state. Evelyn was still at her desk when I walked in, and when she saw the papers in my hand and the look on my face, she immediately poured me a glass of whiskey and told me to sit down. I told her everything, from the public humiliation at the restaurant to the locked bank accounts, and she smiled a slow, dangerous smile that made me feel safe for the first time in hours. She told me that Julian and his mother were arrogant fools who had let their sudden wealth blind them to the legal realities of how Julian's software company Novatech actually operated. Before Julian and I got married, I had spent 2 years writing the core database algorithm that allowed Novatech to process data 10 times faster than its competitors, a proprietary code that I had personally patented. Because we were deeply in love and planning our future together, I had licensed that patent to Novatech for a nominal fee of $1 per year, with a very specific clause embedded deep in the contract. The licensing agreement stated that the patent license was strictly contingent upon my active involvement in the company's strategic planning, or in the event of a marital dissolution where I was not the at-fault party. The license would automatically terminate within 30 days of a divorce filing. Julian's high-priced corporate lawyers had never bothered to read the original licensing agreement from 7 years ago, because they assumed Julian owned the intellectual property outright. Evelyn called her lead forensic accountant, a brilliant man named Marcus, and told him to begin a complete, deep-dive audit of Julian's personal and corporate finances. She told me that we were not going to react publicly, we were not going to argue, and we were going to let Julian believe he had completely crushed me so that he would lower his guard. The next morning, I received a barrage of text messages from Qley, sending me screenshots of her Instagram posts showing her and Beatrice at the luxury restaurant, captioned with hints about a toxic weight finally being lifted from their family. Julian also texted me, telling me that I was being childish for not signing the papers immediately, and that he would cut off my health insurance by the end of the week if I did not cooperate. He wrote that my silence was proving exactly why he was divorcing me, claiming that I lacked the drive, the ambition, and the sophistication to walk alongside a modern tech mogul. I did not reply to any of his messages, following Evelyn's strict instructions to let him dig his own grave while Marcus began his financial investigation. 3 days later, Marcus called us into Evelyn's conference room, his face illuminated by the glow of 3 different computer screens covered in complex financial spreadsheets. He revealed that Julian's sudden urge to divorce me was not just about his growing ego. It was a carefully planned financial maneuver to hide millions of dollars before his company's stock options fully vested. Marcus had discovered a network of offshore shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands and Panama, all established under Beatrice's maiden name and managed by Julian's brother-in-law. Over the past 18 months, Julian had quietly transferred over $4 million of marital assets into these shell companies, claiming them as consulting fees and marketing expenses. He had also purchased a $5 million luxury estate in Aspen under a blind trust, which he was planning to move into with his 24-year-old chief marketing officer, Penelope. My heart sank as I saw the photos of Julian and Penelope vacationing together in Paris during a time when he had told me he was on a high-stress business trip to secure investors. He had used our joint savings to fund their luxury getaways, buying her designer bags and diamond jewelry while telling me that we needed to budget tightly because the company was going through a delicate transition phase. Evelyn tapped her pen on the desk, telling me that this was not just standard asset hiding, this was blatant criminal fraud that would void our prenuptial agreement entirely. The prenup I had signed stated that in the event of a divorce, I would only receive a flat payout of $50,000 and would waive all claims to his company and future earnings. However, Evelyn explained that under state law, any prenuptial agreement could be completely set aside by a judge if there was proof of active, intentional fraud, hidden assets, and bad faith negotiations. She looked at me and asked if I was ready to ruin Julian's mood permanently, and I smiled, telling her that I wanted to dismantle his entire life piece by piece. Our first step was to play along with Julian's arrogance, so I sent him a carefully worded email, pretending to be absolutely devastated, broken, and desperate. I wrote that I was struggling to survive, that I could not afford a lawyer, and that I begged him to meet me at his office to discuss a slightly higher settlement so I could get back on my feet. As expected, his ego flared up immediately, and he replied within minutes, telling me that he was glad I had finally accepted reality and that he would allow me to come to his office on Thursday afternoon. He warned me not to bring any drama, because Penelope and his mother would be present to ensure that the signing of the papers went smoothly and without any hysterics. On Thursday, I walked into the sleek, glass-walled headquarters of Novatech, wearing an oversized, faded sweater and no makeup, looking exactly like the defeated, broken woman they wanted to see. When I entered Julian's corner office, Beatrice was sitting on the leather sofa, sipping an espresso, while Penelope stood behind Julian's desk, her hand resting possessively on his shoulder. Julian looked down at me from his leather chair, a smirk of absolute superiority on his face as he pushed the pen and the modified settlement agreement toward me. He told me that he had generously added an extra $10,000 to the settlement, making it $60,000. But only if I signed a non-disclosure agreement that forbade me from ever speaking about our marriage or his company to the media. Penelope smiled sweetly, telling me that this was a very fair offer for someone who had not contributed anything to Novatech's recent success, and that I should sign it so everyone could move on. Beatrice added that I should use the money to move back to my hometown and find a simple job that matched my simple capabilities, rather than trying to cling to Julian's success. I looked at Julian, letting a single tear fall down my cheek, and asked him if he truly believed I did not deserve a share of the company that was built on my own algorithm. Julian laughed, leaning forward, and told me that my algorithm was just a basic piece of code that any entry-level programmer could have written, and that his brilliant marketing and leadership were the only reasons the company was worth millions. He boasted that he had outsmarted me at every turn, and that even if I tried to fight him, his high-priced corporate legal team would drag the case out for years until I was completely bankrupt and homeless. He openly admitted that he had taken precautions to ensure I would never get a single penny of his true wealth, laughing as he said that smart men always stay 5 steps ahead of their wives. What Julian did not know is that I was wearing a high-grade, hidden recording device that was transmitting our entire conversation directly to Evelyn and her legal team, who were sitting in a parked van right outside the building. Because we were in a one-party consent state, this recording, which featured Julian openly admitting to hiding his wealth and boasting about ensuring I would get nothing, was completely legal and highly admissible in court. I picked up the pen, looked at the document, and then slowly laid it down, my tears instantly vanishing as I stood up straight and looked Julian dead in the eye. I told him that I would not be signing his papers today, and that instead, he should prepare himself for the storm of a lifetime. Penelope scoffed, telling me to stop making pathetic threats, while Beatrice shook her head, calling me an ungrateful, low-class drama queen who was making a fool of herself. Julian told me to get out of his office and warned me that his offer of $60,000 was now officially off the table, and that he would make sure I left with absolutely nothing. I smiled at them, wished them a wonderful afternoon, and walked out of the office with my head held high, immediately heading down to the van where Evelyn and Marcus were waiting. Evelyn was grinning from ear to ear, holding up the recording device and telling me that Julian's arrogance had just handed us the keys to his entire empire. The very next morning, Evelyn officially filed our response to Julian's divorce petition, along with a motion to completely invalidate the prenuptial agreement based on systemic, multi-million-dollar financial fraud. We attached the forensic accounting reports detailing the Cayman Islands shell companies, the Panama accounts, the hidden Aspen estate, and the transcripts of Julian admitting to hiding his assets. At the exact same hour, I exercised my rights under the original patent licensing agreement of Novateca's core database algorithm. I sent a formal, notarized revocation of the patent license to the board of directors of Novatec, informing them that due to the divorce filing and Julian's bad faith actions, their license to use my intellectual property would officially terminate in exactly 30 days. Because Novatec was a publicly traded company, their legal obligation to disclose material risks to their shareholders was absolute and immediate. Without my patented algorithm, Novateca's software platform would instantly lose its speed advantages, rendering their entire product suite virtually obsolete overnight compared to their competitors. The board of directors went into an absolute, frantic panic, realizing that their CEO's personal life and arrogance had just placed the entire multi-million-dollar company in extreme, catastrophic jeopardy. By Friday afternoon, Julian's phone was ringing off the hook with furious calls from his board members, investors, and major clients who had caught wind of the impending intellectual property crisis. He sent me dozens of furious text messages, demanding to know what kind of game I was playing and threatening to have me arrested for extortion and corporate sabotage. He wrote that I was destroying the company he had poured his soul into, and that he would make sure I paid for every single dollar of lost stock value. I blocked his number and let Evelyn handle all communication, as she prepared for our first emergency court hearing regarding temporary spousal support and the validity of the prenup. When the day of the hearing arrived, Julian showed up surrounded by a team of 5 corporate lawyers in expensive suits, looking visibly stressed, but still trying to maintain his arrogant facade. Beatrice and Qley sat in the gallery behind him, whispering loudly about how I was a gold-digging parasite who was trying to ruin an innocent man's life. Penelope was also there, wearing an expensive designer outfit that had likely been bought with my marital assets, giving me cold, dismissive glares from across the courtroom. Evelyn stood up when the judge called our case, and with absolute calm and precision, she presented the court with the evidence of Julian's massive financial fraud. She played the audio recording of Julian in his office, boasting about how he had hidden his wealth, how he had outsmarted me, and how he had ensured I would get nothing from our marriage. The judge's face grew increasingly dark as Julian's voice echoed through the courtroom, openly admitting to financial manipulation and mocking the legal system. Julian's lawyers frantically tried to object, claiming the recording was a violation of privacy, but the judge quickly overruled them, stating that the recording was highly relevant to the issue of bad faith negotiations and asset dissipation. Evelyn then presented the detailed forensic ledger showing the $4 million transferred to the offshore shell companies managed by Beatrice's family. The judge looked directly at Julian and asked him to explain why millions of dollars of marital funds had been sent to a Panama company owned by his mother's brother-in-law during the marriage. Julian stammered, his face turning a deep shade of red as he mumbled something about international marketing campaigns and strategic business structuring. His lead attorney tried to step in, but the judge silenced him with a sharp wave of his hand, stating that the evidence of deliberate, fraudulent asset hiding was some of the most egregious he had seen in his entire career. The judge immediately ruled that our prenuptial agreement was completely null and void due to systemic fraud, active deception, and unconscionability. He then ordered that all of Julian's personal bank accounts, corporate stock options, and the offshore assets be immediately frozen pending a full trial to determine the division of property. To make matters worse for Julian, the judge awarded me a temporary spousal support payment of $45,000 per month, to be paid directly from his corporate salary to cover my legal fees and living expenses. Beatrice let out a loud gasp from the gallery, clutching her chest, while Qley looked like she was about to throw up as she realized their access to Julian's wealth was suddenly cut off. Julian stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock, fury, and sudden fear, realizing that his attempt to throw me out with $60,000 had just cost him millions. But the nightmare was only beginning for Julian and his family, because the board of directors of Novatech was not about to let him drag the entire company down into his personal financial ruin. On Monday morning, the board held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to suspend Julian from his position as CEO, citing a breach of fiduciary duty and the catastrophic risk he had posed to the company's intellectual property. They stripped him of his executive powers, locked him out of the corporate offices, and launched an internal investigation into his use of company funds for personal expenses, including his trips with Penelope. Within 48 hours, the news of the CEO's suspension and the impending patent license revocation leaked to the financial press. Novatech's stock price plummeted by over 35% in a single day of trading, wiping out tens of millions of dollars of paper wealth and causing panic among their largest institutional investors. Penelope was promptly fired by the board of directors, who wanted to distance themselves from any association with Julian's personal scandals and financial improprieties. Suddenly, the glamorous life Julian had promised Penelope evaporated, and without his massive corporate income and frozen accounts, she realized he was no longer the wealthy tech mogul she had targeted. Within a week of being fired, Penelope packed her bags, left the luxury apartment Julian was leasing for her, and was spotted by local media vacationing with a wealthy real estate developer in Miami. Julian was left entirely alone in his empty penthouse, facing a mountain of legal bills, a pending corporate investigation, and a divorce trial that was set to strip him of half of everything he owned. But I was not done yet, because Beatrice and Qley still needed to face the consequences of their active participation in Julian's scheme to defraud me. Marcus had discovered that the $4 million hidden in the Cayman Islands had been partially used by Beatrice to buy a luxury condominium in her own name, as well as a brand new sports car for Qley. because these purchases were made using marital assets that had been fraudulently transferred to avoid division in the divorce. They were legally classified as fraudulent conveyances. Evelyn immediately filed a motion to join Beatrice and Qley as third-party defendants in our divorce lawsuit, seeking to claw back the condominium, the car, and all the funds transferred to their names. The court issued a freeze order on Beatrice's bank accounts and placed a lien on her new condominium, preventing her from selling it or taking out any loans against it. Beatrice was absolutely hysterical, calling my phone from a blocked number and begging me to show some mercy, claiming that she was an elderly woman who could not survive a legal battle. She wept, saying that she had only been protecting her son and that I was being cruel by trying to take away her home and her dignity. I told her that she should have thought about dignity when she sat in that restaurant celebrating my eviction. And then I hung up the phone and blocked her forever. Qley also tried to reach out, sending me a long, dramatic apology email, claiming that Julian had brainwashed them into believing I was the enemy, and begging me not to take her car away. I forwarded her email directly to Evelyn, who added it to our pile of evidence showing that the family was fully aware the assets had been hidden in bad faith. As the trial date approached, Julian's legal team realized they had absolutely no chance of winning, and that a full trial would only expose more of Julian's corporate financial crimes to the public and the SEC. The Securities and Exchange Commission had already opened a preliminary inquiry into Novateka's financial filings due to the offshore transfers Marcus had uncovered. Fearing federal indictment and complete financial ruin, Julian's lawyers begged Evelyn for a settlement conference to end the litigation once and for all. We agreed to meet in Evelyn's office, the very place where I had fled on the night of my anniversary, but this time, the power dynamic was entirely reversed. Julian walked in looking like a shadow of his former self, his clothes wrinkled, his hair unkempt, and his face pale and exhausted from weeks of sleepless nights. He sat down across from me, his arrogant smirk long gone, and looked at me with eyes that were filled with genuine, desperate defeat. He whispered that he was sorry, that he had let his sudden success get to his head, and that he had been a fool to listen to his mother and sister, who had constantly pushed him to get rid of me. He begged me not to destroy him completely, asking me to leave him with enough dignity and capital to rebuild his life and save his reputation in the tech industry. Evelyn slid our final settlement proposal across the table, and it was a masterpiece of absolute, merciless justice. Under the terms of the agreement, Julian was required to return all $4 million of hidden offshore assets directly to me, representing my 50% share of the marital estate plus damages for fraud. He was forced to transfer the title of our luxury city penthouse, which was fully paid off, solely into my name, along with all the high-end furnishings and art inside. He had to sign over the title of the $5 million Aspen estate to me, which I plan to sell immediately to fund my new investment firm. Regarding Novatech, I agreed not to revoke the patent license, but only under the condition that the company pay me an annual royalty of 7% of their gross global revenue for the next 15 years. Furthermore, Julian was required to sign a strict, ironclad non-disparagement agreement, with a penalty of $100,000 for every single public or private negative comment made by him, Beatrice, or Qley about me. Julian's lawyers looked at the document, then looked at Julian, and slowly shook their heads, signaling to him that this was the absolute best deal he could hope for to avoid prison time and complete bankruptcy. Julian looked at me, his hands shaking as he held the pen, and asked me if I really hated him this much after everything we had been through together. I looked him in the eye and told him that I did not hate him at all, but that I was simply ensuring he got exactly what he deserved for trying to ruin my life on our anniversary. He slowly put the pen to the paper and signed his name, officially ending our marriage and stripping himself of nearly 90% of his accumulated wealth and power. Once the papers were signed, the dominoes fell with brutal, satisfying speed for the rest of his family. Beatrice was forced to sell her luxury condominium to pay back the fraudulent conveyance judgment. And because her frozen bank accounts were cleared out to cover my legal fees, she had to move into a tiny, rundown studio apartment on the outskirts of the city. She now lives on a meager pension, unable to afford her luxury lifestyle, and has been completely shunned by her former high society friends who want nothing to do with her family's scandal. Qley had her sports car repossessed and was forced to drop out of her expensive private university because Julian could no longer afford to pay her tuition. She now works as a receptionist at a local clinic, earning minimum wage and spending her free time trying to delete the years of wealthy social media posts that now look like a mockery of her current reality. Julian's reputation in the tech world is completely shattered. No major tech company will hire a former CEO who was suspended for financial fraud and patent negligence. He is currently living in a rented, one-bedroom apartment, working as a mid-level software consultant for a small firm, earning a fraction of what he used to make and spending a large portion of it paying his remaining legal debts. He tried to contact Penelope several times, but she blocked his number and publicly denied ever having a serious relationship with him, calling him a desperate, unstable ex-boss. As for me, my life has transformed into something more beautiful and successful than I ever could have imagined during my darkest hours. I sold the Aspen estate for $6.2 million and used the proceeds, along with my share of the offshore assets, to launch my own venture capital firm, focusing on funding women-led tech startups. My firm, Phoenix Ventures, has already successfully launched 3 highly profitable startups, and I am now recognized as one of the most influential female investors in the region. I live in my gorgeous, sun-drenched penthouse, surrounded by true friends and colleagues who respect me for my intelligence, my resilience, and my achievements. Every year on the anniversary of my divorce, I host a massive, elegant dinner party for my team, my lawyers, and my closest friends, serving the most expensive champagne in the world. I raise a glass to the man who thought he could throw me away like trash, because his arrogance was the catalyst that finally allowed me to claim the empire that was always mine to build. The peace I fought so hard to secure lasted for exactly 14 months before the desperate remnants of the family I had escaped tried one final, disastrous gamble to drag me down. It began on a Tuesday morning when my assistant notified me that a process server was waiting in the lobby of Phoenix Ventures with a federal summons. Julian, backed by his mother's relentless prodding, had hired a disgraced but notoriously aggressive attorney named Richard Vance, who specialized in high-profile litigation harassment. They had filed a massive federal lawsuit against me, alleging that the original core database algorithm of Novatech was actually a collaborative work developed by a team of offshore developers Julian had personally paid. The lawsuit claimed that I had committed corporate espionage by stealing the source code from Julian's personal laptop during our engagement and fraudulently registering the patent under my sole name. They were demanding the immediate cancellation of my patent rights, the return of all royalty payments I had received, and $50 million in punitive damages for what they called a decade-long intellectual property heist. To maximize the damage, Richard Vance had leaked the entire filing to several major technology blogs and financial news outlets hours before I was even served. Within minutes, sensationalized headlines began popping up across the internet, questioning the legitimacy of my patent and portraying me as a fraudulent spouse who had built her venture capital empire on stolen technology. I watched as my phone lit up with urgent notifications from my partners, investors, and several founders of the startups Phoenix Ventures had recently funded, all panicking about the potential fallout. My mother-in-law, Beatrice, was so emboldened by this opening move that she broke her non-disparagement agreement by posting a lengthy, tearful video on a newly created social media account. In the video, she claimed that her family had been driven into poverty by a calculating, cold-hearted sociopath who had stolen her brilliant son's life work and used corrupt lawyers to silence them. Qley immediately shared the video across her platforms, adding commentary that labeled me a corporate thief and a master manipulator who deserved to be behind bars. I did not panic, nor did I allow myself to react publicly, because I knew that desperation always makes people sloppy. And Julian's family was as desperate as they came. I immediately called Evelyn and Marcus to my office, and within an hour, we were sitting around my conference table, surrounded by the physical and digital remnants of Novateka's earliest days. Evelyn was actually laughing as she read through the federal filing, pointing out that Richard Vance's entire case rested on a series of newly discovered digital commit logs and email threads from 2015. These documents supposedly proved that an offshore developer in Eastern Europe had written the foundational blocks of the algorithm months before I ever registered the patent. Evelyn told me that if these documents were real, we would have a serious problem, but she knew Julian. And she knew he lacked the intelligence and the patience to hold on to such explosive evidence for 7 years without ever mentioning it. She turned to Marcus and told him to begin a forensic deep dive into the electronic files that Julian's legal team had attached to their federal filing as exhibits. Marcus spent the next 48 hours running advanced metadata extraction protocols on the PDF copies of the emails and the source code commit logs Julian had submitted to the court. When he finally called us back into his lab, he had a look of absolute, professional disgust on his face, which quickly turned into a cold, triumphant smile. He revealed that the digital documents submitted by Julian's legal team were complete, fabricated forgeries, constructed with terrifying but ultimately flawed precision. While the visible dates on the emails and code commits said 2015, the embedded metadata showed that the files had actually been created, edited, and saved on a local server just 3 months ago. Julian had hired a freelance coder on the dark web to write a modified version of my algorithm, backdate the system files, and inject fake developer comments to make it look like original work from his old startup. Even worse for Julian, the hacker he had hired had left a hidden, proprietary digital watermark inside the code structure, which Marcus was able to trace back to a specific cybersecurity forum where Julian's personal email address had registered an account. Julian had literally forged federal evidence, committed perjury in a signed affidavit, and engaged in a massive conspiracy to defraud the federal court system. Evelyn's eyes gleamed with a predatory light as she realized what we had in our hands, telling me that this was no longer a simple civil dispute, but a fast track to federal prison for my ex-husband. She told me that we were not going to show our hand immediately and that we would allow Julian, Beatrice, and Qley to dig themselves even deeper into their public smear campaign. For the next 3 weeks, we remained completely silent, refusing to issue any public statements or defend ourselves against the mounting wave of online criticism. This silence convinced Julian and his attorney that they had us cornered, and they began doing interviews, bragging about how they were going to expose the biggest fraud in the history of the tech sector. Julian even appeared on a popular business podcast, looking smug and polished, claiming that he had stayed silent for years to protect his ex-wife, but could no longer allow the truth to be hidden. He openly boasted that he was going to take back his company, his wealth, and his dignity, and that my era of unearned luxury was officially coming to an end. Once we had collected every single piece of public footage, every interview, and every social media post from Julian, Beatrice, and Qley, Evelyn officially filed our counterclaims. We filed a massive lawsuit for federal civil conspiracy, malicious prosecution, tortious interference with business relations, and gross defamation, seeking $75 million in damages. Along with the lawsuit, Evelyn filed an emergency motion for evidentiary sanctions, attaching Marcus's flawless forensic metadata report and the digital trail linking Julian directly to the code forgery. The federal judge assigned to the case, a notoriously strict and no-nonsense jurist named Judge Abraham, was so disturbed by our filing that he ordered an immediate, mandatory evidentiary hearing. He commanded that Julian, Beatrice, Qley, and their attorney, Richard Vance, appear in his courtroom in person, warned that failure to do so would result in immediate bench warrants. On the morning of the hearing, the courtroom was packed with journalists, tech bloggers, and representatives from several major venture capital firms who wanted to see how the battle would unfold. Julian walked in wearing a custom-tailored suit, flanked by his mother and sister, who were smiling and waving at the cameras as if they were arriving at a movie premiere. Richard Vance looked incredibly confident, carrying a thick leather briefcase and patronizingly nodding at Evelyn as they took their seats at the opposing tables. I sat next to Evelyn, wearing a simple, elegant dark suit, looking calm and completely unfazed by the circus they had created around us. The hearing began, and Judge Abraham did not waste any time, immediately calling Marcus to the stand as an expert witness to explain his forensic findings regarding the alleged 2015 documents. Marcus projected his computer screen onto the courtroom monitors, walking the judge step by step through the metadata of the files Julian had submitted under penalty of perjury. He showed the court the exact timestamps proving the files were created just 90 days prior. And then he pulled up the registration logs of the dark web forum showing Julian's personal credit card paying for the forgery services. The courtroom went dead silent as the sheer scale of the fabrication was laid bare on the massive screens for everyone to see. Richard Vance's confident smile instantly vanished, his face turning an ashen gray as he frantically began flipping through his notes, realizing his client had completely lied to him and used him to submit forged evidence. Julian's face drained of all color, his eyes wide with terror as he stared at the digital breadcrumbs that proved he had orchestrated the entire fraud. Beatrice looked confused, whispering frantically to Qley, who had suddenly stopped smirking and was staring at her phone as if she wanted to disappear into the floor. Judge Abraham leaned forward over his bench, his voice dripping with pure, icy fury as he looked directly at Julian and his legal team. He asked Richard Vance if he had performed any basic due diligence before filing a $50 million federal lawsuit based on digital files created 3 months ago. Vance stood up, his voice cracking as he stammered that his client had assured him the files were authentic, and that he had no idea they had been manipulated or fabricated. Judge Abraham silenced him, stating that Vance's negligence was a disgrace to the legal profession, and that he would personally be referring him to the State Bar Association for disbarment proceedings. He then turned his attention to Julian, asking him if he understood the criminal consequences of fabricating evidence and committing perjury in a federal courtroom. Julian tried to speak, but only a high-pitched squeak came out of his throat, before his attorney quickly pulled him down and told him to remain silent to avoid further self-incrimination. Evelyn then stood up and presented the court with the physical logs of the non-disparagement violations committed by Beatrice and Qley over the past month. She played Beatrice's tearful social media video and showed screenshots of Qley's malicious comments, proving they had acted in concert with Julian to destroy my business reputation. Evelyn pointed out that these actions had directly caused 2 major pension funds to temporarily delay their planned $20 million investments into Phoenix Ventures due to the fabricated scandal. She asked the judge to issue an immediate, summary judgment on our counterclaims, arguing that the defendants had forfeited their right to a trial by engaging in a systematic, fraudulent abuse of the judicial process. Judge Abraham did not hesitate, issuing a ruling that was more devastating than anything we could have ever hoped for. He dismissed Julian's lawsuit with prejudice, meaning it could never be filed again in any court in the country, and ordered that all of Julian's claims were completely fraudulent. He then granted our motion for summary judgment on our counterclaims, holding Julian, Beatrice, and Qley jointly and severally liable for $75 million in damages for defamation, civil conspiracy, and breach of contract. Furthermore, because Julian had committed blatant perjury and fabricated evidence, Judge Abraham announced that he was making an official, immediate referral to the United States Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution. Before anyone could leave the courtroom, 2 federal marshals stepped through the back doors, approached the defense table, and placed Julian in handcuffs, arresting him on federal charges of perjury, obstruction of justice, and wire fraud. Julian let out a desperate, choked sob as the metal cuffs clicked around his wrists, looking at his mother with eyes full of absolute terror as he was led out of the courtroom in front of dozens of flashing cameras. Beatrice collapsed into her chair, weeping hysterically and screaming that this was a misunderstanding, while Qley sat frozen in terror, realizing that their $75 million liability meant they were completely and utterly ruined. The news of Julian's arrest and the exposure of his massive fraud spread across the internet faster than the initial lies, completely clearing my name and solidifying my reputation as a brilliant, untouchable force in the tech community. The pension funds that had hesitated immediately apologized and finalized their investments, adding an extra $10 million to my fund as a gesture of goodwill and respect for how I had handled the crisis. Richard Vance was officially disbarred within 3 months. His career ended in absolute disgrace, and he was forced to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in sanctions to my legal team. Julian, unable to afford bail because his remaining assets were seized to pay my massive judgment, sat in a federal detention center for 9 months before his criminal trial even began. Faced with overwhelming forensic evidence and the prospect of a 20-year sentence, Julian pleaded guilty to federal charges of wire fraud, perjury, and fabrication of evidence. The federal judge sentenced him to 7 years in a medium-security federal prison with no possibility of parole, ensuring he would spend his prime years behind bars in a drab jumpsuit. Because of the joint liability of our $75 million judgment, my legal team initiated foreclosure and asset seizure proceedings against Beatrice and Qley. Every single asset they had left, including Beatrice's remaining personal belongings, Qley's bank accounts, and even their furniture, was seized and auctioned off to satisfy a fraction of the debt they owed me. Beatrice was forced out of her small apartment and had to move into a tiny, state-subsidized room in a run-down retirement home, where she now spends her days cleaning communal areas to earn pocket money. She has no phone, no internet, and no luxury, living out her remaining years in the exact kind of poverty she had spent her entire life trying to avoid. Qley was forced to declare Chapter 7 bankruptcy, which will ruin her financial credit for the rest of her life. And she is currently working 2 separate retail jobs just to pay her basic living expenses. She is legally required to turn over 25% of her meager wages to my estate for the next 20 years to satisfy the outstanding defamation judgment, ensuring she will never build any wealth of her own. Her social media accounts, which she once used to boast about her family's unearned wealth and mock my middle-class background, are now completely deleted, and she lives in absolute anonymity, terrified of anyone discovering her true identity. With Julian's criminal conviction and Novateka's stock trading at pennies on the dollar due to the scandal, the company's board of directors filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. I waited patiently for the bankruptcy auction, and when the day arrived, I bought the remaining assets, intellectual property, and physical headquarters of Novatek for a tiny fraction of its former value. I officially rebranded the company as Phoenix Technologies, integrating its infrastructure into my venture capital portfolio and putting my own name on the building where Julian had once tried to humiliate me. Today, I stand at the absolute pinnacle of my career, possessing the wealth, the respect, and the complete peace of mind that my former husband and his family tried so desperately to steal from me. I proved to them and to the rest of the world that you can never truly destroy someone whose success is built on genuine intelligence, hard work, and integrity. And every time I walk past the executive suite of Phoenix Technologies, I smile, remembering that Julian's attempt to ruin my mood on our anniversary was the very thing that allowed me to own his entire legacy.